All right, can everybody hear me? Am I loud enough? Should be. I'll be getting started in just a second. I'm having slight internet problems right now, so you might get a little lag. I apologize for that. I think it's on YouTube side because I did a speed test. My internet's been fine, so I'll get started in just a second. Let me get everything arranged. Nice. Okay. So welcome everybody to the stream. As you know, we're gonna be doing making the most of external tools on the stream. But before we get started, we'll do the typical channel update announcement. Then we'll do some Q&A, and then the main content, and then another round of Q&A. So we do have a new question system. If you want to get your question to me, for sure, use any of the prefixes Q colon, question, or question colon, and then put your questions in the chat. And then that will push it over to my Discord and put it in a queue where I can make sure I answer the stuff. So if you have questions about anything we're going over in the stream, or just questions in general, anything involving external tools or licenses, costs, anything like that, feel free to ask those in the comments, and I'll be sure to get to them if I can. So while you're doing that, we'll go through some of the channel updates and announcements. The first is there's a brand new slogan for the channel. If you saw the OAuth video on Sunday, you know what it is. It's engineering communicated with unparalleled clarity. And I changed it from the other one because I wanted the slogan to reflect exactly what the content is intended to be. And the content is intended to be exactly that. It's engineering topics communicated with unparalleled clarity. So you get no fluff, you get just the content and the stuff, and everything's fine. Second thing is going to be there are still stickers for sale. They are at emkc.org/stickers. I'll put a link in the description of the video if you're watching the replay. Feel free to pick some of those up. I've given away / sold about probably 240 of the 300 I have, so I have a few more. So if you want any of those, they're nice 2" by 2" vinyl stickers. You can put them on your laptop or wherever you want, and you can pick some of those up there. If you are an EMKC master or supporter or Nitro booster, anything like that, then please DM me or a staff member, and you can get a coupon for 2 free stickers, and I'll ship them anywhere in the world. So if you are not in America, that's perfectly okay. I'll ship them to wherever you are at no charge. This is the second to last video from the, I guess the final video of season 2 Engineer Man streams. So the very last video, of course, is fan project review. So time's starting to run out on that. You got 2 weeks from today to get those submissions into me. You can send those into projectreview@engineerman.org. I've gotten some really good submissions. Total, I've gotten 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I've gotten 11 submissions so far. I probably have room for another maybe 3. So definitely get those into me as soon as you can. And the only requirement for it is it has to be open source, or at a minimum you have to provide me the code, just because I'm not going to run some untrusted code on my computer. So I do need to be able to see the code, and I do need to be able to see how it works, just to make sure everything is going to be good for that. So if you have a really cool project that you're really proud of and you want to have it shown on stream 2 weeks from today, please be sure to send it in to projectreview@engineerman.org, and I'll make sure I give it a quick review and show everybody. It'd be pretty cool. The next topic is the 300K video, and I made a note here. I swear it's not. It probably seems like a meme at this point. Oh, the 200K video, it never came. 250, it never came. But I want you to know that myself and a couple other people, we did work on a 250,000 video. It just didn't come out good. I thought I had a really good idea in my head, but when I finally started doing recording and we started putting it together, it didn't meet the bar, for it just didn't get to the point where I wanted to actually put it out. It didn't end up being a good video. So I do have a new, really cool, really great idea for 300K. I've already written all the content for it. All I gotta do is record it. I got an editor ready. I got an audio guy ready. It's going to be really cool. You're going to like it. I'm going to try to release that at 300K. I'm planning on actually finishing all the recording part of it this weekend, and hopefully it can get done here in the next like 2 to 3 weeks. So it, I promise you, it is coming. It just probably hard to believe now because I've it's been 77,000 more subscribers since the 200K, but I promise it's coming. The last thing is the advent of code. We are on day 13. No, we're on day 14 of 25. So if you want to get involved in the advent of code, there's a channel dedicated for it on my Discord. It's called Advent of Code. And in there, you can get started on it's basically one challenge every day up until December 25th. And, well, I'm sorry, 2 challenges. Well, it's 1 challenge, 2 parts. So 2 things in total. You can use any language you want. You solve a quick problem, and then it just annotates it for the day. You can always, and you can get started right now. Like you can do day 1 today. You don't have to make sure you do it all on the same day. But there's going to be some prizes for whoever comes first. I have 3 sticker packs here. There's been a lot of people who are doing the advent of code, so I might pick up another 3 of these, and I will mail one, it's about 15 stickers, and then I'm going to add some of my own, some Engineer Man stickers in there as well. So you should get between like 15 and 20 stickers, and I'll probably buy 3 more. So I'll send it to the top 6 people who are not staff. So, and you can always check the leaderboard. Just go into the channel and do Felix AOC how to, and that'll give you everything you need to know about the advent of code over there. So that's it for channel updates and announcements. Let me check out some questions here. So there's only one question. Have you ever seen the Leo editor? I would love to get your opinion on it. I don't know what that is. I've never seen it. You should definitely post it in the chat or on Discord so I can take a peek. But thank you for that question. I apologize I haven't seen it. Okay, so there's no questions, no problem. We'll get right into the content then. And I can see that I'm dropping tons of frames. I'm sorry, it's probably laggy. I really apologize for that. I don't know how to make it better. All right, stream segment. There we go. So the whole purpose of this stream today, it's all about making the most of external tools. It's kind of an inevitability that in development in 2019, you're going to run across some external tools. There's just no way around it, either because the standard tool in a given area, such as consider databases, for instance, there's some databases that just everybody uses, and they're all external tools. You're not going to be building your own database, from scratch unless you have some really crazy custom use case. So it's kind of impossible to get around it. So this stream's all about kind of making the most of those tools, and also, as a related topic, selecting the right tools and some kind of considerations, when you're looking at these things. So there's a few primary goals, when you're working with external tools. The first is you're trying to not reinvent the wheel. And because oftentimes, remember, this is 2019, we have the best technology that there's ever been so far, and there's really no reason to reinvent the wheel at this point because there's lots of really nice wheels that are already out there. And that's one of the goals of using the tool. The other thing is software dev is really expensive. So if you're starting out a new project, obviously for a personal project, well, there is one exception to the reinventing of the wheel. If you're doing it purely for learning and you just want to understand how something works, the best way to learn about how something works is in fact to reinvent the wheel. So that's kind of the one exception. There's no better experience you'll get in learning about a particular thing than to actually reinvent the wheel. So we're speaking more about if you have an idea in mind and you're doing kind of a set project and you're trying to get it going quick, something like that, then it doesn't make sense to reinvent. But the other point is software dev is expensive. So if you're running on a tight budget, maybe you have limited cash, something like that, then you got to keep in mind that does it make sense to build it yourself? Because you got to pay for that, either with your own time or you got to pay money to people who will build it for you. So it's tough. And then kind of a related note there is that time matters. If you're trying to rush to get something to market to try to get your product there first, then it doesn't really make sense to kind of build something on your own. It just makes sense to reach out there and there's lots of open source software. You can just grab it all and put it all in your application, and then you're kind of a good ways there already. So, time counts. And remember, your users, they're not going to know what you're using on the back end, and they're not going to care either. Users only care about their user experience. They care about your product working and not much past that. So, it doesn't really matter. It's all about, how you can get it out there quicker. So I have kind of my own personal selection criteria when I'm working with external tools, and it sort of goes like this. The single most important thing to me is, does this tool do everything I need? That's the most important thing to me, because if it doesn't, then it's not helpful. And then the second thing I look for is, am I going to have to migrate away from this tool in 3 to 5 years? And that's something you got to look at, because if you're picking a tool that is kind of a dead end, then you're going to have to do a migration to a new tool sometime down the road. The problem with that is the bigger your application, the more complicated and messy a migration might be. And depending on how much data you have, obviously if you have tons of data, it's difficult to migrate data if the tool that you're changing is somehow related to that data. So you got to kind of take that into account. Next thing I look at is if I'm looking at paid tools, which it's okay, you don't have to do all free stuff, all open source stuff. There are paid tools and they do have their benefits. We'll talk about them later. For paid tools, you got to look at, is there an additional cost associated with the use of this tool? And sometimes there's an upfront cost and there's an ongoing cost. Maybe there's a subscription. So you got to look at that. And the reason you got to calculate this cost is because, I did mention before, software dev is expensive, but, is it more expensive than paying for a tool? Because at some point, those lines cross. Obviously, if you pay $10,000 for a tool, but you can build it on your own for $4,000 worth of development time, then it makes sense to just build it yourself, versus using some other tool. Yeah. So you got to look closely at what are the costs. And, there's some software, particularly like, I'll pick on Microsoft, because that's fun. If you buy like SQL Server, I don't know if it still is, but it used to be a cost per CPU core, per amount of RAM, and so on. So, and then you got to look at, how does that scale over time? If your app is 100 times as big, does your cost go up 100x? Well, maybe. If your resources necessary to service the load goes up 100x, then so would your cost. So that's potentially a problem. And so that's, I covered the fourth point, is it feasible to build this tool myself? And I did write, core versus full. Sometimes there's tools that give you 50 things, 13 things you need, and then 37 things you don't need. So it's worth looking at, what's the core pieces of a given tool that I really need to kind of make my project function properly. And then sometimes it's worth saying, well, we got this tool we can buy, but I only need like 5% of it. Maybe it is worth just building that 5% on my own and then saving that cost. But that's kind of the primary thing. Do I need it? Am I gonna have to migrate away? What's the costs? And is it worth just building it myself? Vladimir said, broad consideration does not contain UI. Devs don't care if you're almost reflectory, what's that say? Almost reflectory used in the thing a particular way, 10 years. Yeah, so UI, I mean UI, it's sort of up to the person working. You know, some people are used to. I assume when you say UI, I assume you mean like the development tool has a UI to assist in development. And if that's what you mean, then I guess that's probably a consideration. There are people that prefer to work in a UI kind of environment. This is very common in a Microsoft stack because most Microsoft products are, you know, UI based. Not a whole lot is done in the terminal. Of course, that's changing over time. And if you have the right knowledge and the right tools, you can certainly do things at the terminal. But broadly speaking, you know, Microsoft does prefer the graphical UI over anything else. So if you're not in a Microsoft stack, then it really just depends on kind of the reflexes. It's almost reflexes. Used to do a thing in a particular way for some 10 years. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, people get into patterns over time, you know, where they get really comfortable with one thing, but the only thing about that is if you are one person in a team of say 30 and only you are comfortable with something that's possibly outdated, then you kind of got to just say, well, sorry, you're just the one guy. You know, there's still 29 other people, you know, that would rather use the modern tool, and in which case, you know, you sort of lose there. But thank you for thank you for that input. I appreciate it. That's definitely a valid point. UI for sure. So next time I want to look at is kind of these broad considerations, and these are things that, like, when you're trying to make the most out of external tools, you want to at least consider or look at all of these things. It's cost, license, maturity, open and closed source, you know, module systems. We'll talk about why that's important here in a second. Maintenance and development, support, and I threw in Stack Overflow in there, and because Stack Overflow has the, I know Stack Overflow is not a broad consideration for other tools, but Stack Overflow does have, you know, it's sort of this enigma where it's really useful but also really awful in the same way, and we'll talk about kind of why that is. So, you know, one broad consideration is of course cost. You know, if the cost is high, it might not make sense to, you know, buy. Of course, open source software is usually free, but there are times where it's not, and we'll talk more about that later. You know, licenses is like how you are allowed to use a particular tool, and some of them are permissive and some of them are not so permissive. And again, each of these topics, like each of these broad considerations, I have a lot more notes, so I'm just briefly going over these. You know, the maturity of the project matters. You know, maturity meaning, you know, how long it's been around, how many active users does it have, how many contributors, you know, what's its code velocity, you know, those things matter. Open closed source matters, you know, whether you can actually see the code. Sometimes you need to see the code, you know, perhaps for some regulation, or that you need to actually be able to audit the code yourself. In that case, you know, closed source is not preferable. Module systems is kind of about how these tools are distributed. You know, typically when you're downloading tools, you are not downloading them directly. You're usually doing them through a moduling system, and this in itself has some challenges, and we'll discuss exactly what those are here in a moment. Maintenance and development is important because you want to know that the tool you're getting invested in is being maintained. You know, because if you pick tools that are either inactive maintenance or inactive development, then you're relying on something that has the possibility to just not be a thing, you know, in the future. And of course, that's not ideal. So we'll talk more about what that means in a little bit. Support is the next thing, and support's huge because what happens when things go wrong? And you know, a lot of open source software has no support mechanisms, and you know, there's upsides and downsides to that. You know, obviously the trade-off is you probably got it for free. So you know, there's ups and downs. We'll talk about, again, we're going to go into detail on each of these. And then Stack Overflow, we'll talk about more about that at the end. Again, it has its complications, it's useful, but there's also some things wrong with it. The question was, could you tell us how you parse those Q colons off in YT chat? So basically what happens is our bot on Discord just watches the whole chat. It's kind of the same as a Discord bot, except it's for this. GPU Professor Wally. Love your live streams, thoughtful, instructive, and lack distractive bias. Build versus buy. Oh, RE build versus buy. Whether someone can just pick it up and support it, or if you sell your company, can someone else take the reins? Yes, and that's actually very important, because also thank you very much for the 20. And I've seen you here a couple times. I appreciate the support. It means a lot to me. It's very important, and that's actually a good point that I didn't even cover here. Is if you're building a big company and you're building it with the expressed intent to sell it off to another business, then the first thing they're going to do is they're going to say, how's your technology stack? What's it looking like these days? And you're going to have to show them, as a person who's trying to sell their business, you're going to have to say that, oh, well, we're using tool A, tool B, tool C, and tool D. And they might take exception to one or more of those, and that could be a problem. We're going to talk a little bit later about the whole Oracle versus Google, debacle. And just imagine being a prospective purchaser of something like Android, knowing that you're in the middle of a lawsuit with Oracle. That just totally devalued your product. So, like, tools matter, and that's one case where somebody's not going to want to buy your stuff if they know that there's a lot of drama coming. So thank you for bringing that up. That's important if you go to sell your company. My thoughts on Golang, they're roughly the same as my thoughts on Rust. I think they're two languages attempting to solve separate but related problems in their own respective ways. I think they're both good tools. I've been doing a lot of Rust. I don't do a ton of Golang, but of course, the Pizza, of course everybody knows Pizza from Discord server. He is a big Golang guy. He swears by it, and it's very powerful. I've done a project in it. I think it's nice. I think you should check them out. I think you should check them both out. I don't think that they compete. I feel like Golang covers a certain area and Rust covers a certain area, so I think it's fine to check out both. Java versus C and Linux, definitely. Again, they're kind of separate. I'm not a big Java guy. I am a really big C guy, just because I enjoy that kind of level of programming. But lately, of course, with the advent of Rust and these other tools, it's making less and less sense to use those kind of languages. But I still do like C, although C does not compete with Java. You often won't pick one over the other. So I think here again, I think it's worth looking at both for sure. They're both extremely popular. Okay, moving on to the content. So the first big category here is going to be cost. And the first takeaway here is that paid stuff is not always better. That's just not what it is. And I say that because, sometimes you're in kind of a niche market where the only thing you have an option to is a paid item. It's often thought of that paid is better. And that's just because, obviously you're paying because somebody paid to have something built, and kind of the expectation there is that the software is more stable, it's better tested, it's got better support, and this and that, but that's not always the case. The second thing is that paid stuff is not always necessary, and that's because they do oftentimes, a lot of paid software, particularly in development, does have its one-to-one analog for open source software. Take something as large as like Slack, for instance. There's a tool out there called Mattermost, which is nothing more than just a Slack clone, but it's completely free. And this is true everywhere. But, here again, that product, you're not going to get the support that you would get with Slack. And you're not going to get, they are developing the product, but, under what incentive is always the problem. So if you have paid stuff as well, depending on the tool, it can get costlier over time. And that's back to the whole like Microsoft stack kind of stuff. If you're, Thank you very much for the 10. Charanjeev, I hope I got your name right. If I didn't, I apologize. Thanks for the 10. I haven't seen you here before, so welcome to the stream. If it's your first time, if it's not, then welcome back. So if you're picking a tool that has kind of a linear growth of cost, either from usage or something else, then that's potentially a problem. However, you also have to look at if your cost increases linearly, but your revenue is increasing exponentially, then that cost doesn't matter. It only matters if your cost outpaces your revenue with the revenue that tool is helping produce. So you just got to kind of look at what's going on with that. Kind of the next broad category of things here is licenses, and this can get a little muddy and a little problematic. And again, we have a note here, Google versus Oracle. We'll talk about that here in a moment. But paid product licenses, the concerns with a paid product license is generally around like how and when you can use something. With open source, you don't have that problem. Oftentimes, if you have a permissive open source license, you're free to essentially use it however you want, up to and including making direct copies of it and changing it and redistributing it or whatever you want to do. So you got to look carefully at the paid product licenses to see what you're allowed to do. Again, I keep picking on Microsoft, but that's because they sell overpriced software with non-permissive licenses. And this is one of those times where if you're not careful, you can find yourself, with a large bill. So for open source licenses, you got to watch out for those too. Just because it's an open source license doesn't mean you're just totally free to do whatever you please. Vladimir, thanks for the 40 rubles. For the memory of proprietary hardware, yeah, proprietary hardware drivers. Yeah, nobody thinks about that either. That there's hardware related drama that can come about with things as well. So thanks for bringing that up. So back to open source licenses. Just because it's open source license doesn't mean it's permissive. Like take the AGPL for instance. The AGPL license effectively says that if you use this software, you must also release the software you've included in as open source. And this is a really big problem if you're developing proprietary software, because you effectively can't use AGPL licensed software. You'd have to release your proprietary software also as open source. And this is not ideal. So, but there are licenses that are good. The APL, the MIT license, the BSD license, the public domain license. There's tons of licenses that are very nice. And fortunately, as I wrote here, fortunately, the majority of the open source software is going to be licensed under these permissive licenses. Also, just one note, I know I've dropped 30% of the frames on the stream. I'm really sorry. It's really bad timing that it's not working too well. Hopefully it's not too disruptive. Try to bear with me on this. So the Google versus Oracle thing is sort of interesting because Java is free. You're able to take Java, you're able to build things with Java, but deep down into the Java license, you'll find this little thing that says you can't reinvent Java, make it not compatible with the JVM or the JDK and all that, and then call it Java. And that's kind of essentially what Google did. Basically, Google reached out to Oracle and said, we want to license Java to use in Android. And they did that because at the time they didn't want to use OpenJDK, because there is an open implementation of Java that is completely free to do whatever you want. But at the time, Android was starting to get big. It wasn't super stable. They wanted to use the Oracle version. So basically, and it wasn't even Oracle at the time. I think it was Sun Microsystems at the time, but I'm just using those kind of one and the same. Kind of at the time, they told Google, yeah, you can license it, but pay us this massive sum of money. But then I guess there was some future expectation of possible royalties or this and that, and Google decided, forget it. This is not permissive enough, so we're gonna kill that deal. So what Google did instead was they built what's called a clean room version of some core Java APIs. And a clean room version is nothing more than putting developers in a room and saying, redevelop Java without looking at Java code. And in this way, you can build all the same stuff, but you own all that code. However, Oracle contended that they didn't just use clean room versions. They also took a lot of the code from actual Java and put it into their own Google Java. I'm just going to call it Google Java. And that this created a big problem. They end up being sued for it, and they end up winning. And one might think, well, how does anybody get sued for using free software? Well, they did. And that's because deep down in the license terms, they violated one of them. So I say all this to say that, you know, sometimes open source licenses are complicated and you got to be careful. But obviously here again, you know, if you're a multi-billion-dollar company, you're certainly a bigger target than if you're just making a couple $100,000. So, you know, you don't have to worry much about this in the near term, but, you know, the minute you're making bags and bags of cash, somebody's going to come after you. That's just what it is. So the next thing we're going to look at is, you know, maturity. You know, when you're trying to make the most out of tools, you want to pick things that are mature. And again, there's tons of software out there, so it's not hard to find mature tools. And the thing about a maturity of a tool is that users that use open source software are also in a way the testers of that software. And that's just because people who are authoring open source tools, they often don't have the resources that a bigger business has. So they rely on community feedback. And then of course, people by using a tool are also testing it, because if they use a tool and it doesn't work, then then people will report it. They'll say, hey, I tried to do this thing in your tool and it just didn't work. So newer tools, of course, have more bugs and they have more security problems. You know, they're supposed to get sorted out, you know, over time, and they will. So that's why you want to look at how mature is this product. Yeah. Bonnie, thank you for all the Python videos. You're welcome. I'm glad they've helped you out. So you want to look at the mature software. Otherwise, you're going to get things that are riddled with security bugs, things like that. So you want to avoid hype tools as well, unless stability is not an issue. You know, and when I say hype tools, I'm talking about like, you know, this shiny new object in the open source world that everybody's jumping on, even though the project's only been around for 3 weeks and it's not super tested or anything like that. You know, it's okay to use that stuff if you want to just be on the bleeding edge of what's going on. But if you need any kind of stability and you need to make like a future-proof decision, then you're going to want to avoid these hype tools. I'm seeing some questions. Let me look here. Oh, actually, never mind. Okay. So there's a couple good indicators of software maturity. You know, one such indicator is going to be stars on GitHub. You know, if you see something with 13,000, 15,000 stars, then you can kind of bet that that's a pretty good piece of software, in that there's a lot of people using it. So that's a pretty good indicator. You know, if you're in the like 30, 40,000 stars, then that's really good. And you can also look at things like contribution velocity, you know, new and resolved issues, and also pull requests. You know, just go into their pull requests and see what they're doing with them. You know, if there's pull requests that have been sitting open for months, then obviously nobody's looking at that. And that's an indicator that the people, maybe they're not super active on that project. Same thing with new and resolved issues, you know, because you can see them both. You can see if the maintainers are responding to these issues. You can see if they're being closed or being marked as duplicates or anything like that. And this alone gives you good indication on how involved the authors of the software are with their own software. And then the contribution velocity, you can look and just see how many contributors there are, how often they're committing code, how many lines they're deleting and adding. And from that alone, you can get an idea on how this, you know, when you're looking at contribution charts, what you really want to see is you want to see a nice even line. You don't want to see it go down, because that's showing that people are either giving up on it, or they don't want to work on it anymore, or something else. Also, has it been deprecated in favor of a new tool? That's not ideal. So for open and closed source stuff, open source has one major advantage, and it's that it can be modified. One of the best ways to make the most out of an external tool is to just take a tool that does almost what you need it to do, and then modify it the rest of the way so it does exactly what you need to do. That way you kind of get yourself 85% of the way there, just by using another tool kind of as the base for your own tool. And people in open source, they often benefit from tools that have huge backing. And this can be seen with things like Facebook's React or Twitter Bootstrap or something like that. The reason these tools are so widespread and mature is because Facebook and Twitter are saying, we built this tool, and this tool is good enough for us. And often the us is a company that's a lot larger than the one that you're building. So, Facebook is incentive, I put incentive-driven development, and I wrote that to say that, Facebook is incentivized to make React the best it can be. And if it's good enough for them, it's certainly good enough for everybody else, because they're doing a lot more traffic and a lot more load than we all are. And same thing with Twitter Bootstrap. There's a reason that they put these tools out there, and it's because, first they want to increase their own kind of brand awareness. There's, people, lots of people have used, Bootstrap, the CSS library, but a lot of them don't realize that Twitter authored that in the beginning. It used to be called Twitter Bootstrap, back in the day. Now it's just plainly Bootstrap. They dropped the Twitter off, I think version 1 or version 2, and now they're up to version 4, building out this really great piece of software. Question is only somewhat related to the topic. I just switched from Vim to VS Code as a main IDE for mostly Perl-focused programming. Any suggestions or familiarity with VSC as an IDE and must-have extensions? So I don't personally use VS Code. I know a lot of people do. Hopefully somebody else can answer that in the chat. But I do know some extensions that I can't live without with Atom, and I'm sure they have their same ones on VS Code. The first, of course, is the minimap on the right-hand side. I can't really live without that. The beautifier, tabs to spaces converter, and then the highlighting of all, I like to be able to double click a word somewhere in my code, and I like it to just highlight all the versions of that word so I can get a quick kind of look at, what variable appears everywhere. That's very useful. And I'm sure that each of those has a equivalent on VS Code, but somebody else would be better to answer that than I would. Wasim asks, I have about 4 years experience in programming, still struggling to read open source codes. Any tips for me? So I think it's funny you bring that up, because that is a problem. It is very tough. So I guess my tip to you would be, first, try to understand, well, actually, here's the first tip, is try not to look at it on GitHub. Don't do that. Just start by cloning that project down to your computer as a first step, because from there, you can at least make use of the tools that your editor offers to help you kind of look at this open source code. So that's tip number 1. Tip number 2 is, before you start looking too deep into the code, try to read up on kind of the concepts of operation about a given tool, and then that should help you kind of understand why each file is a certain way. And then the third tip is, try to find in the README something that relates to something like a project structure. If the tool is very mature, then it should say this folder contains this, and this folder contains that, and this folder contains this and that. And if you do that, then it should give you a little better indication on kind of how the GitHub project is broken up, which hopefully will allow you to understand it a little better. But your concern is definitely a valid one. Sometimes it's really tough to read other people's code, and sometimes it's really tough to understand how a project works without, using it for a long period of time. So your concern is very valid. Can I please recommend some resources for learning backend development? That's kind of broad. I mean, you'd have to state like what sort of backend development, a language or a tool or something like that. But I would say that the general response to that would be to just read the documentation on the particular tool that you would like to use for backend development. Okay, moving on. So for closed source, there's no real reason to prefer closed source. This is mostly kind of a byproduct of purchasing a product. Oftentimes if you purchase a product that has no open source version, then you're going to just get the binary and you don't get to look at it at all. I don't know of a specific reason why you would say, no, hide the source. I don't know why you would do that. So, excuse me, so modeling systems, this is kind of an interesting thing because modeling systems are kind of the accepted way in 2019 to distribute external tools to people. This is like NPM for JavaScript, the Python package index for Python, Ruby gems for Ruby, Composer for PHP, Maven for Java, CPAN for Perl, etc., etc. There's tons of places to get software. The problem with modeling, there's two problems with modeling systems. The first is that sometimes it hides the maturity of the software. It's really easy to just go to a package system and say, oh, cool, this is the exact package I need. But if you were to just take one additional second and actually click on the GitHub link to go to the GitHub project, you'd see that there's only like 2 stars and there's been no commits for 2.5 years. And this is an immediate red flag. Of course, you don't want to take that particular software because it's effectively dead. If nobody's worked on it in 2 years, then it is what it is. Now, that isn't to say that you shouldn't take that code. Of course, if it's a really small package that does some kind of discrete task, then it's perfectly okay to take that code, build upon it within your own project and use it. But as far as like just downloading it and depending on their API, I don't see why you do that, because it's never going to receive another update again, and that's a problem. The second problem with modeling systems is there's a big thing recently where a package in NPM was hijacked by a malicious actor, causing cryptocurrency to be robbed from somebody. And the way they did this is they found a Bitcoin wallet project. I don't remember the exact project. We'll just call it Bitcoin wallet. And then somebody looked at what modules Bitcoin wallet depended on, and it depended on some project called like Event Stream or something like that, some really low level thing that had tons of dependencies, but it was not maintained a whole lot. So this malicious actor, trying to act in a good faith way, said, hey, you know what? I want to take over this project. I want to take over this project and work on this event, whatever. And then the other maintainer was like, sure, man, take over the product. No problem. Here you go. Work on it, do whatever you want. And then this guy introduced a backdoor or a piece of malicious code in something that a Bitcoin wallet depended on. So he released this new version saying, oh, updated features or whatever. The Bitcoin wallet people, bumped their version to use this now malicious piece. And then all of a sudden, everybody's wallet was running a malicious piece of an underlying module that they then used to steal stuff, private keys and whatnot. So that was like a huge deal, because this product was depended on by tons of additional software. And just nobody was the wiser. Everybody just assumed that everybody in open source is a good actor, but that was not the case in this case. So that's, if you want to make the most out of modules, it behoove you to make sure you understand exactly what that module is doing. Yeah, I'd say security issues is the first consideration when pulling in various packages. Absolutely. Every time I add a new module to my project, that's not like the gold standard, something like that, I always think to myself, which one of these is going to be malicious? Because I believe a lot of people in open source, the vast majority, we're talking the 99.99% of people, I think are being good stewards of the open source community, but there's always going to be somebody that's going to try to gain an edge and do bad things. And this was one such example. But yeah, it's a huge consideration. Fortunately, the bigger the project, the more eyes on the project, the less likely it is, people keep each other in check, sort of thing. Obviously if there's a team of 10 people working on something, then unless they're all in on it, which I don't know. I don't think people are that nefarious, but certainly it's possible for a solo project that gets taken on by another person who nobody knows anything about. Then it's those instances that you get put in this position where that person can do bad things within that package. Do I write Java? I do not. Well, actually, yes, I do. So I only use Java when I'm doing Android development, but outside of that, I don't ever use it. Sorry about that, my dog went crazy. Beware of abandoned projects, sometimes backfires. You use something, improve, and alas, you're getting a ton of feature requests. Yeah, well, that's, sometimes people, come here. Sometimes people like your products. That's just kind of what happens. And yeah, the problem with abandoned projects is that that kind of goes back to the whole it sometimes hides the maturity of software. Like the abandoned project, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad project. It very well may have some really good code in it. It's just it's not going to get any additional code. So that's the issue. First time watching a live stream of Engineer Man. Well, Dreaming Warlord. Well, welcome to the stream. I hope to see you on some additional ones. Yeah, I apologize for the really loud barking. I didn't realize it was just suddenly going to occur. Rest in peace, headphone users. So for maintenance and development, beware of abandoned projects or soon to be abandoned projects. You want to look to see if a project has a roadmap, and really good open source projects have a roadmap. They say, here's where we're going 1 year from now, 2 years from now, or even 3 months from now, 6 months from now. But just because they don't have a roadmap doesn't necessarily make them like a bad project. But the ones that have a roadmap, I feel like you can really count on them. You can also look at something I didn't mention here is you can look at who's a monetary backer. Like Node.js, for instance, is a fully open source project, but they got huge backing, both from, I don't know if Joyent still backs them, but they're certainly getting backing from the Linux Foundation, and there's a lot of people who want to be involved in that project. So it's worth kind of looking at that. You want to look to see if they have a solid release history to gauge release schedules. You don't want to get involved in a product that's, again, that's just going to die. You want to get involved in a product that's going to have continuous releases over time. And then you want to see if they follow semantic versioning. If just because you see somebody's at version 17 doesn't mean they've had 16 major versions or 16 major versions beyond version 1. It could just mean that they don't know how to use semantic versioning. So you want to look to see, are they following it properly? And the reason that's important is because the way semantic versioning is supposed to work is the first number is supposed to be major, second number is supposed to be minor, third number is supposed to be patch. And they do that because when the major number increases, you have possible backwards compatibility breaks. So when you go from version 4 to 5, you know that you're going to have to take some steps to kind of make your old code work. This is not true when you go from 1.0.0 to 1.0.1. That's just a patch. That should not make any changes to the API. It should not break any existing code or anything like that. Same thing with minor. So if they're not following semver properly, like if they're making massive features and they're just incrementing the minor number by 1 and they just break all your code, then that's not good. That's something you want to avoid. And then the last topic we're going to look at is support. Open source software is typically limited to community support only, and that's just because if they're not getting revenues, how can they afford to support their own product? And this is just what it is. A lot of open source software is developed by people who are just passionate about a given area and they want to produce something nice for the community. The second group of people is people who like build a product for their own company and then decide to open source it because it's really good, either because they just want to offer it up just because they are kind of like a pay it forward kind of thing. If you've been using open source software to build your business your whole life and then you yourself create a piece of open source software, then it might feel good to just put that out for everybody. I got a question here. Absolutely with you on older projects not necessarily being bad. I used a 7+ year old abandoned GitHub Python project to help me archive a nonprofit's Yahoo group content. Yeah, exactly. It's like if a project was developed over a period of 3 or 4 years and then it had no more commits, then there's still probably some really good code there. And the same is true of projects that just like there's one project out there called Moment, which is a JavaScript time library, and I was briefly considering becoming a contributor with them, and I was looking at their kind of contribution guidelines, and they're talking about how there's only so much you can do with time, and Moment.js is a project where they've like literally done everything you can do with dates and times in JavaScript. So obviously their code velocity has gone down, but that's not because they don't care about the project anymore. It's just because date and time, there's only a finite number of things you can do with date and time, and they've already done it all. So in that case, it's not bad software. It's actually really, really, really good software, even though it doesn't get a ton of work, on it anymore. Yeah, that's right. Agree. If it was really good when they quit working on it and it's still good forever, it's just not going to get any better. That's right. And it's also not going to adapt to anything new. That's actually probably the biggest issue is if you have a piece of software that hasn't been updated in 4 years, it might be good at the point of 4 years ago, but is it compatible with newer software? Like if somebody develops a Node.js project for Node.js 2, and now we're up to Node.js 12, then will that particular piece of software even work on Node.js 12? Because that's a way a project could just go obsolete just because it has no more compatible versions to run on. Because people aren't going to use Node.js 2 forever. They're going to just keep moving up in the version numbers. So there is open source software that occasionally has a paid offering, which comes with a higher degree of support. And this is often how these open source software providers make their money, is they offer professional support or professional consultation, typically by the authors of the software. Some examples of this is Red Hat, Nginx Plus, and then like MySQL Standard and Enterprise, which are all paid offerings. And oftentimes those tools are at their core the same community open source offering, but they contain some additional stuff kind of around it. Obviously Red Hat is built on the Linux, the Linux kernel, but it's all the stuff that they wrap around the Linux kernel that represents their kind of paid offering, which comes with better support. And then obviously your paid and closed source software usually comes with great support. Here's one kudos I will give to Microsoft. Of course, you have a phone number you can call to get help with anything, anytime, and this is true of all of their paid software. This is not so true of free open source software. And we got about 4 minutes left, and we'll use that time to talk about Stack Overflow. So I wrote memes, and I couldn't actually find the meme, but there's a meme where it says like it's like a castle, and then it shows Stack Overflow, and then it says my code, and it has that same castle copy and pasted about 150 times. And I thought that was funny. It's funny because it's true. That's why it's funny. But it also shows us an interesting point, and that point is if you're not careful, you get a piece of software built from using copy and paste versions of a bunch of code on Stack Overflow. So Stack Overflow is a fantastic tool in that it pretty much has answered every discrete software question that's ever been asked on the planet to this point. The bad thing is it has dubious levels of quality, and people are so accustomed to just saying, how do I do X and Y? And then they copy paste it into their code, and then that's it. They don't worry about anything past that. And the problem with this is if you don't understand how that code works, how can you understand how your program works? So my advice for people using Stack Overflow to make the most of Stack Overflow, make sure you understand what you're copy and pasting. Don't just understand the end result. Don't just understand that this 80 lines accomplishes task A via the black box that is 80 lines. Look at it and say, oh, so that's how you do that. That's the process you can use to accomplish this particular task. Oh, cool. Use it as a learning opportunity. It's going to do two things for you. It's going to make you a better programmer, because Stack Overflow isn't bad. You're not a bad developer if you use Stack Overflow. However, I'd contend that you're doing yourself a disservice if you simply copy and paste stuff from Stack Overflow without understanding how it works. You're harming yourself and you're harming your project, and that's just my opinion. So you shouldn't compose your whole application from Stack Overflow. All right, we got a couple minutes. Let me just make sure I got all the questions. If you have any questions, put them in the chat now. This is your moment. Let me check here. Browser's code is so clean I can't read it. That's good. All right, let's see. How do you feel about ads on NPM? So I recently, every time I install Core.js, I get an ad for Core.js, basically saying support Core.js on Patreon, support the author, this and that. And I get it. Like, people want to be paid for their efforts, but from a guy who creates content largely for free, and puts a lot of time into things and requests really nothing in return, I kind of take exception to that. I think people should do things because they're passionate about it and not try to leverage, a modeling system like NPM to just display ads to everybody. So I didn't appreciate that when that guy did that. Do you like MS PowerShell? So I don't use Windows. I'm a Linux main. I haven't used Windows for anything other than video games in probably over a decade at least. So I don't have a ton of experience with Microsoft, and I don't know much about PowerShell other than it's supposed to be the Microsoft version of Bash, I guess. You are the GOAT. Just curious if you know what's happening in Python on the C level when you're coding Python. So thanks for the question, Jackwood. And thank you for the compliment. Appreciate that. So part of being a good programmer is understanding how your high-level code translates into low-level instructions. But that said, can you write highly efficient, highly optimized Python? To an extent, you can certainly be efficient in Python, but Python is still going to turn itself into machine code in a deterministic way, and you don't get to pick that way. That's based on the Python interpreter. But I do occasionally think to myself, what does this Python code look like when it gets boiled down to, say, assembly? and again, Python's not ahead of time compiled. It's just in time compiled, but you still do get machine instructions as the program's executing. So sometimes I think to myself, what is it doing at a low level? But with high level languages like Python, PHP, JavaScript, this and that, it's not as useful to understand as another language. So I do, but not a ton. How does one ensure security with open source external code scanning tools, if any? So this is another opportunity that I'm going to take to give Microsoft some kudos, which I don't do that often, but I will say that they're doing a really great job with GitHub, actually. I've seen more features show up in GitHub just since Microsoft has owned GitHub in probably the 3 years preceding that. And the reason I bring this up now is because one such thing is they're doing automatic audits of open source software. And then they have bots, I think it's like a Dependabot, something like that recommends, version bumps in various tools to say like, this tool is susceptible to SQL injection or something like that. And then they say you should bump this version to 4 to 5 or whatever. The only problem is what Dependabot doesn't always realize is that bumping from 4 to 5 also breaks your code. So it's not that smart. It's not smart enough to know will it break your code, but it is smart enough to know that you have a package in your project that is susceptible to some type of security problem. So there's also static analysis that you can do on code to determine if there's any problems, but I primarily just rely on, and so far it's worked out for me, for decades now, that I rely primarily on, are other people using it? I rely on the idea that a large group of people will find problems in something. Should I write my own compiler when I program? Sometimes I need things from other languages when I'm coding in other programming language. Can writing my own compiler make projects better? Probably not. I mean, compilers are very complex. Like I think GCC compiler it's got more lines of code than the entire Linux kernel. I think it's up around like 12, 13 million lines of code. So it's like I'm of the opinion that GCC is smarter than everybody, typically. The one exception being if you are smarter than GCC, in which see rule 1. So but there's a lot of people who to like make improvements over GCC requires understanding all the intricacies of GCC. There are definitely big brain people out there who will say, you know what, I know this piece of code GCC is going to do bad things with. So I'm gonna let it take it down to x86 assembly, and then I'm gonna hand code some of my own assembly in there, and then I'm gonna compile it down to machine code. So if you can do that, but there's not that many people who have that in-depth amount of knowledge, who know exactly the cases in which GCC is going to not be so well. Rule 1 is see rule 2, and rule 2 is see rule 1. So yeah, I would say unless here again, if you're just doing it for the knowledge, write your own compiler. Absolutely, I've done it. I've done it because I wanted to understand. I wanted to understand how that kind of stuff worked, and it was very beneficial to me. Okay, I think we're pretty much at the end here. Let me just scan chat real quick. Yeah, I think we're okay. Okay, so we're all set. So I'll just give my last kind of thing. I appreciate everybody coming to the stream. We do have a Discord server. It's got about 7,000 people on it now. So if you'd like to come take this chat further or get involved with some like-minded people on various software development kind of topics, and if you want to interact with me, I'm always in there. You're always free to say hi to me. I'll say hi back. I always do. So I'm active in my own server. if you would like to come check that out, there'll be a link here in the chat in a moment, and there's lots of cool things going on there, as well as like Advent of Code is going on, and you can also, it's also a good place to interact with the community and kind of give input to the channel as well. So if you're not on there, you should definitely come check that out. And then I appreciate everybody who's came back for another stream. I love seeing the same people over and over here. I'm glad that you are enjoying my content. Again, this is the second to last stream. The last stream will be exactly 2 weeks from now, at noon on December, let's see, December 28th. And that's going to be the fan project review. And that's going to be our very last one. I just want to give everybody a heads up on what we'll do after that. So I'll take probably a month-and-a-half break from streams, and in that time, maybe 2 months, and in that time, I'll make a channel on Discord and we'll discuss kind of what season 3 will be. And I'll get some feedback from the community and some feedback from the server, and we'll figure out another 10 or 11 streams to do over the next 5 months or so. After that, we'll probably resume live streams at the middle of February, maybe around there, and we'll get that moving again. So if you want to give input for that, certainly be on the Discord server here in about 2 weeks. I'll be opening that channel up for discussion, and we'll figure out what I should talk about after that point. Noon at what time zone? It's going to be noon at Central Standard Time, so it's going to be 6 p.m. GMT, I believe. Yeah, 6 p.m. GMT is going to be the time for the streams. So other than that, we've concluded the stream. I hope everybody has a fantastic rest of their weekend. I hope that this stream really helped you, and I hope to see you on the next stream or a video or on the Discord server to come hang out with us. Other than that, have a great rest of your weekend and take care.